Hi, welcome to Growing Edge, the show about transformation. So there's 3 rules, which is dress for radio, don't be boring, and always remember the rule of 3. So today's episode is about systems thinking, and it's another topic that's, again, fairly new to me, but where I've come across systems thinking in terms of maybe a story and narrative that makes a lot of sense is around the famous cat drop episode. And this is a slightly apocryphal tale about a number of events that happened in the 1950s, I believe, in Borneo. And the story that I recall goes something like this. There was a problem with malaria. So the United Nations decided to basically drop some DDT or similar chemicals to try and kill the mosquitoes, and surely enough the levels of malaria went down. But then some other things kind of happened that proved that the problem was slightly more interconnected and problematic than the UN had really bargained for. So there were 2 unusual circumstances occurred. The first one was, I believe, the insecticide killed a wasp, a parasitic wasp that laid its eggs in a certain type of caterpillar. That caterpillar was then, the wasp basically died out because of the DDT, and therefore there was a growth in that particular organism, and the caterpillars basically ate the roofing of the houses, and everybody's roofs started falling down. The other thing is that the insects were eaten by lizards that were then, as a predator, they concentrated larger parts of DDT inside them. They're eaten by the cats. The cats died, which meant the rat population went up, and eventually brought in things like, I believe, a type of plague variant. So what happens is the poor people in Borneo, they'd have malaria. So we put some DDT in to reduce the malaria, and now all of their roofs have collapsed, and everybody's catching plague. So I suppose that's a type of systems thinking in a way. And I'm wondering what our panel think about that. How does that allow us to maybe enter the conversation? What's going on there?
It raises the concept, Chris, of interconnectedness that you wanted to talk about, that and multiple unintended consequences, and not just the first thing that happens, but the knock-on effects of all the things that you do. It might also be the reason why systems thinkers are very often slow to take action.
It also speaks well of an inability in the 50s to distinguish the difference between an ordered system, where you could actually predict the outcome of an intervention, and a complex system where the only thing you can predict is that there will be unintended consequences, good and bad. And certainly there's we now have frameworks that would allow us to actually distinguish those kind of systems, and doesn't stop people from still assuming that everything was ordered and intervening as if they knew what they were doing.
Suppose. Yes. I was Luke, you're on mute.
You're muted, Luke, yeah.
Mute.
Right, there we go.
I wasn't looking at my system. No, yeah, so I think that one of the good news about systems thinking is this aspect of unintended consequences, right? So be aware of that which is unknown in the future, and keep a lookout for that. I would just add to that, perhaps that is even the most important part, to put that unknown in the center of your thinking. And I think that systems thinking does have a lot of good things going for it. I mean, with all those feedback loops, which you can observe, which you can reinforce, which you can use to collect data to basically know what you're doing. So I'll just leave it there. I think that's a good part about systems thinking.
But I suppose it points to a certain problem with the way people normally go about tasks. Is they normally try and bound a problem quite early so they can commit to a course of action, And I suppose that's what happened, is people were thinking there's an immediate problem, there's an immediate solution, we need to do something quick, let's go and do something. So I suppose that part of the challenge then is that people have a bias towards action, perhaps.
I'd say that's exactly it. There is that's the trap of a bias to action. You know,
yeah, action even comes before the bounding of the problem, right? Yeah, forget figuring out what's going on. Let's just act straight away, right?
Yeah. There are some circumstances where that's the appropriate thing to do. If whatever system you're in has, for whatever reason, fallen into a state of utter chaos, then you may need to act first to regain some control before you can actually really figure out what to do beyond that. You know, if my house catches fire, I will probably throw a chair through the window and leave the house that way. It's not how I usually leave. My wife would get terribly upset if I tried that too often. But it would be an appropriate act now, rather than sitting there stroking my chin thinking, I wonder what I should do about the house being on fire.
Well, I'm glad we brought in the concept of kind of boundaries or framing. I wanted to say, I think what we're after is trying to distinguish different kind of situations, not different kind of systems. Systems are the things that we create to make sense of the world. And I do think that thing, acting too early or acting too late, are equally bad. And you do often see people, there's some great videos on Reddit of people having a kitchen or an experimental fire and acting in haste, that sequentially makes things worse. I shared one recently as a good analogy for Brexit.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, exactly. So there's a young lady who's doing an experiment, and she's trying to set fire to something in a limited way, and it ends up, the whole table setting on fire. So I suppose that part of the problem here then could also be to do with the way we're set up to do work. So is there also a challenge with the fact that if we're compartmentalizing the way that we're set up and organized, then presumably, Conway's law, as it were, our solutions are going to be based on those more simple models of reality rather than the interconnectedness.
I think that's right. It also points to how we're not particularly sophisticated in what we mean by interconnectedness. Are those connections rigid? And if you push on one end, it would push on the other end? Are they elastic? Are they like a tether where there's no connection at all until it kicks in, like a chain, right? Are they intermittent, right? And again, I think this is a trap of not going deep into something like systems thinking and locating it in the whole set of different ways of looking at the world, because it does have implications that, oh, well, now we're using systems thinking, we must understand systems so we know what we're doing. And, the suggestion that Benjamin just came up with, actually do some situational assessment to figure out what kind of system you're in, right? What are the boundaries? What are the connectednesses? Is it ordered? Is it complex? Is it chaotic? Because there's completely different responses or kinds of response in each situation. So yes,
not what kind of system you're in, though, Andrew. That's the distinction I'm keen to make. How is it useful to frame and see the situation that you're in? What way of understanding, which you could call a system, are we going to apply here? Because every situation can be interpreted in infinite numbers of ways. There's no inherent itness to the way in which we're living in a situation. It depends on our framing and understanding and contextualization. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I do. Yes, I think that. I have to admit that one of my most favorite go-tos is the Cynefin sense-making framework, because as a situational assessment tool, I don't know anything better. When I learned that, it suddenly made sense of pretty much every other framework I'd ever come across, because it located where it was going to be useful. And while I agree, yes, everything, there's an infinite complexity of everything. It's really helpful to have some kind of simple model available to you. And one of the things that
with exactly the risk you just referred to, Andrew.
Right. One of the things that you get taught in the Cynefin world is it's probably a good idea to let the data define the framework rather than vice versa.
But your framing will determine the data.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean,
what if you don't have the data, Andrew? Then what? So what if you're in a system situation where, for example, it's the eco life cycle and you're right at the beginning, at the birth, so you don't have the data?
Yeah, very good. That's just perfect. I'm going to back up a little bit to answer that. Dave Snowden's the guy behind the Cynefin sense-making framework. He's been at it for donkey's years. People have been asking until recently, is there a book? And there hasn't been until just recently, because it's been something that itself has been emergent. But in this last year, he's like, oh, I actually think this is now complete and coherent. We could actually present this as now a complete system. And the reason for that is that he recognized that there's a sort of central area of it that had been called disordered. And it was reframed as being confused.
So I'm slightly confused. I'm slightly confused right now because I've got my dog is scratching at the door. So
no, go and don't do it with your dog.
Isn't it?
Yeah, all right. So confused would be exactly where you would be, Mandy, if you were in that situation. But there's two kinds of it. There's an inauthentic confusion where you pretend that you're not confused and you tell people to take hydroxychloroquine and inject bleach. And then there's authentic confusion where you go, we're confused. Lord, what do we do? And actually ask the sensible question of what do we do? We don't know what to do because we're actually confused. What we need to do right now is to start to do what we can to gather data so that then we can start to determine, are we in an ordered system where we can predict what's going to go on, or experts could? Are we in a complex system where we're going to have to experiment our way out and be very careful about being able to roll back things that don't work or potentially, amplify things that do? Is it a chaotic system where actually we do need to take some dramatic action to gain control of the situation? Right? Does that make sense?
The difference between Cynefin and systems thinking is that Cynefin is starting from an assumption that you have something to go on to frame the situation, and in moral situations, there's usually going to be some kind of fallback. Systems thinking would say that, and system, there's no thing. Systems, complexity, cybernetics. It's all one big extended family tree, intertwingled and connected. But you can only get to that situational assessment with some scaffolding. You only get the facts of the situation once you define what counts as a fact, what you're focusing on, where your attention goes, what some of the boundaries are, if you see what I mean. Cynefin starts from a bunch of assumptions that there's something that is capable of making sense, the way you're framing it at the moment, whereas that's always questionable.
I'd just like to make a comment, because that was already several minutes back, which was this question on depth. And I agree with you, Andrew, that it needs some in-depth observation of your environment just to get that going, right? And because I agree. I mean, as I said, sort of, you can apply systems thinking, and you will get some results. But that's already, I see that as part of the problem. This sort of like in-depth observation, analysis. You need time to understand the system, how it interoperates, where all the relationships are. And I don't see that somehow gelling well with how organizations function. Yeah. So all the time you invest in that, all the depth you invest in that. In the meantime, your organization is still running. People are cooperating. They are they're on a hierarchy. There is competition. I don't know. There's so much going on in the meanwhile, which this kind of thinking doesn't seem to incorporate in some way. How people work together, how they make collectively sense. All those questions.
I think that's a really good point.
Independent of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it reminds me of, I think there was something that was posted, unless I'm mistaken, about systems thinkers tended to be bullied at school.
Yeah.
A blog post from Steve Whitler. That's correct. That's true.
Yeah, and that really struck me. And I was just thinking, what is that true? Why would that be a thing? And I suppose that, does that mean, again, does it come back for that bias for action? Do we have a big picture? Do big picture thinkers, do they always, people who are maybe thinking in that way and see the world in that way, is that good for them or not so good? And I suppose in our environment, it's not clear that those are traits that we necessarily reward. Certainly, when being a teenager and being maybe analytical and open-minded may not be a good strategy. Maybe that continues into the workplace. But then presumably there's a bit of a flip. Presumably what happens is things get more complicated, then suddenly those skills become extremely important. I mean, if we think about the climate situation, I mean, that's really showing big time that a lot of our simpler assumptions about bounded problems, whether it's to do with our economies or the way we deal with the energy cycle, we find actually, it's all interconnected. We didn't realize or it was inconvenient, and then we find, oh my word, it's a much harder problem to solve.
Yeah, this sparks up this difference to me about local optimization versus the global context, right? So for sure, in some contexts, action is, I think, like you said, Andrew, action is totally local optimization. Let's go for it. It helps me in this context to move through the world in a way in which gets me good feedback, good results, right? But then the tension for me comes up is, all right, so in how far do I play the most infinite and global game, or do I optimize for this local context, knowing that I'm going to lose points in that bigger context?
That's a really nicely put thing. I think we're at risk of mistaking timeliness of action with levels of understanding. If you see what I mean, equating time with understanding is a mistake. It's not necessarily the case that the more time you spend on something, the more you understand. If you have effective ways of sense making that are competent to the situation in which you find yourself, knowing that all requires definition, then your action can be very timely, but with a very deep understanding. I mean, that's why people train. That's why John Boyd, the creator of the OODA loop, practiced a playbook of moves and responses. That's why we invest our time in thinking and building and understanding these models, so that they can click into place at the right moment, and hopefully not predetermined at the wrong moments. But all of those risks are inherent in what we're talking about, and they're nothing to do with whether you're using systems thinking or calling it something else. I think.
So this might be. Sorry, Andrew, do you want to come in?
Yeah. This points to the whole thing of feedback, doesn't it? That it makes sense to take action if you can count on the feedback that you're getting being a direct consequence of the action that you're taking. And if you're also willing to be responsible for any impacts that may not be inside the boundaries of what you're dealing with, or are just undesirable. I mean, thinking of the climate crisis, a lot of that's come about because of the economic or the economists' notion of negative externalities. It's negative, but it's not our problem. Right? So that's a lack of responsibility for negative impacts. Now, I mean, going to Jeremy's point about local optimization.
That's right, and presumably that's because there are missing variables. The variables the formula that people are using to determine what does good look like is missing bits, isn't it? That's the thing. I mean, it always is. It's always going to be missing things. And
those variables may have been unavailable until after you actually took the action, right? There are some things that you simply can't know ahead of time. I mean, I've worked for ages now in the world of Agile, And it came about as we started to understand that software was emergent, right? So there was stuff that you didn't know at the beginning, and trying to plan everything at the time that you know the least was actually wildly irresponsible. So it makes sense to take action, but only in tiny little bursts, which are a mix of probing into where you're going and actually trying to accomplish something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I was going to say, just on that feedback, point, and then getting into agile and the unknowns. One of my experiences of innovation is working on providing creating a high performing team, knowing that if we're at least high performing, we're able to better deal with the eventuality. So rather than planning, just working on sophistication and productivity and things that we could control, that then meant we were fighting fit to deal with the blows as they were coming in of uncertainty and changes of direction. I mean, one thing that I think is also really interesting when it comes to feedback is people don't always realize that there are so many more variables involved that then form their own feedback loops. And this is like a good maybe a good point for me to talk about my forays into the topic of culture, organizational culture. I used to be a technologist, and I still am a technologist, but I've got more interested in culture and interpersonal dynamics, mainly because I've realized they're very causal. It was really, I was trying to solve technical problems and I couldn't solve them. And I was thinking, actually, this is not a technical problem, or rather it is, but it's a technical problem based on the way people are communicating or interacting in some way, and realizing that that's actually part of the system. So a big one, for example, for me is around the idea of trust. And we did an episode on trust, but I realized that actually, if there was a low trust environment, then the actual outcomes were very different, and the dynamics were very different to when there was a high trust environment. So actually, it wasn't about a matter of, in certain circumstances, it's not a matter of improving the technology. It's a matter of actually building the relationships and building the trust between groups. And, Susan Hasty was on the show a few weeks ago, was talking about the notion of change, turning conflict into tension, creative tension. And I suppose that's very interesting, because what I realized is actually those were just as causal as some of the more, nuts and boltsy technical stuff. It was a system. It was a system that was also, I suppose, the idea of feedback. As far as my limited understanding is, there are positive and negative feedback loops, and I get confused. I had the wrong definition, because I believe a feedback loop that's reinforcing a negative is still a positive. Strictly speaking, I think it's still a positive feedback loop.
It's where the effect builds every cycle.
As the effect builds, it's just the positive feedback loop can create either a desirable and an undesirable outcome, and then I believe a negative feedback loop is something that then counterbalances. So, for example,
stabilizes.
It stabilizes. So, for example, I think a negative feedback loop would be an example of a predator-prey cycle, where I'm a fox, I eat too many rabbits, all the rabbits die off, therefore my progeny die off because there aren't enough rabbits to feed them. Then the rabbits, come back up, and it just oscillates.
It's interesting, Chris, what you're saying about with the feedback loops. But when you get human beings into the system, it can make it complicated. So if you have a culture, society, where you have a notion of it's okay to slap your child so that your child doesn't perform an act which is something that you don't want that child to perform in your culture, then basically that's what you're engendering. You're engendering that kind of a behavior and practice. So then we have maybe a society that actually thinks actually it's okay to have violence. We may call it violence, but maybe in another society they call it discipline. So when it comes to people and human beings and culture, I think that's where within organizations, it creates a breakdown. It creates the chaos, the confusion. I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, for sure. To pick up on that, right? There's also this element of time horizons that becomes so crucial, right? If you want to talk about the time horizon of raising a child, the feedback that I get on that is, how many years later, right? How many decades, lifetimes, generations later that I finally it's possible to even see the consequences of those behavior. So when I think about feedback, what becomes so interesting for me is how can I, if we want to get back to a sort of an organizational work sort of professional context, how can I create an immediacy of feedback that allows me to then navigate effectively? Because if my feedback is coming in fits and starts way down the line or indirectly, it's almost like a lensing, right? That sort of happens. The visual metaphor that comes under my mind is, looking at fish in the water, right? If I have less than immediate feedback, then I have this sort of delay or this additional calculation to do on top of my behavior and the environment or the consequences of my behavior.
That's really good, because it's by extending feedback loops that you can turn an ordered system where you can actually predict how it's going to go into a complex or even a chaotic system. The example I always give when I'm trying to teach people about this stuff is, imagine if you had a car which had a windscreen with a 2-second delay on it. Right? Imagine trying to drive a car like that. So you see the bridge coming and you steer, but actually that happened 2 seconds ago. Oops, now you've gone into a chaotic situation, right? You look at businesses where they follow a sort of waterfall approach, where it's design, build, test, put into production. Well, if that means that the testing gets finished 6 weeks after the developers worked on it, and the developers have been working on something else in the meantime, and the testing sends work back to the developers and they've forgotten how it was working, so now all of those plans that looked so good up front have got scrambled. That's what happens when you don't have an immediacy between what you're doing and the feedback that you're getting on it. Now, in some situations you can't, so you then have to be set up to deal with that appropriately. We've noticed that people don't build cars with windscreens with 2-second delays on them.
So that's coming. They're introducing electronic screens.
Because we just talked about raising a child and now about feedback loops. And I think the raising of the child is a good example where system thinking doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work with raising a child. And that's so obvious for everybody who has observed other parents raising their kids, because actually they work with these positive enforcing loops and are surprised that they don't work, that something's not working out. So we know that mysteriously enough, we are somehow in this blind situation with raising our own children, that we do have effects which we know nothing about, which we are not able to observe, but nevertheless we have them. And that shows again that, of course, when you apply systems thinking, you only look at reality through a certain lens and you exclude all sorts of other information from your assessment.
Why would you do that, Luke?
Well, because that's what humans do.
That sounds like a silly thing to do.
Example of raising children. If you apply that principle there, which many people do, you get all sorts of very bad results, right? And you have no clue why they are so bad in the process, because somehow you believe it's all about input, output, relationships, feedback loops, positive reinforcement, etc., which obviously it is not. It's not good enough. That's not
Andrew just said you only have to follow the logic of that position to understand why a simplistic application of it would go wrong. It's the same as rationality. You only have to follow the logic of rationality to the outer limits to realize the limits and the non-rational foundations of rationality. The problem is, you can't say that systems thinking is good or bad. It can be done well or badly. The whole systems complexity cybernetics thing can be done badly and can let you down. But at the very least, it has within it the kind of conversation we're having now about the risks of lack of timely action, the risks of a too narrow, a too assumptive focus. That's about the best we're going to get ever, isn't it? But you had a conversation in our pre-meet, Luke, about embodied action and how that might be different or add something to this conversation. Is that fair?
No, not really. Just more what Chris said along the lines of culture, and because he raised it, and I think it's this discussion about culture and, for example, raising children is more connected to each other than systems thinking is in raising children. So I think systems thinking somehow doesn't take care enough of this idea of culture and cultural production and constant emergence of culture, which in itself is still a mystery, although we're talking about organizational culture now for, I don't know, 50 or 60 years. So it doesn't really address that question for me, which, again, I'm saying systems thinking is probably one of the best ways how to look at, let's say, organizations, management, processes, and all that. But weirdly enough, it doesn't address that. And it doesn't take that into account. And it doesn't take, let's say, human experience. I think that's what I said, into account, like human individual experience and narrative, which, for example, is important when you're raising children, right? So what sort of experience does that child have? What sort of narrative does it experience? So that's what I'm putting out there, and that's why where I see some heavy limitations in terms of systems.
That's a really helpful distinction. The distinction between complexity science as it is applied to technology and anthro-complexity as it is applied to human systems. Right? There are great differences there, and you're right. Culture. Boy,
it's almost like there are social and technical systems running side by side,
right,
and interfacing with each other.
Yes, and interacting in ways that are more or less visible and more or less predictable. It's a wonder we get anything done, isn't it?
It is. So welcome. So Ed's joined us.
Hi, Ed.
Welcome, Ed.
Hey, how are you?
Hello,
Ed.
Thank you. I'm a little late.
That's great to see you. So what we've done is we've loosely followed the structure of talking about interconnectedness, and we've started dipping into feedback, and we've flirted with emergence, but I think maybe let's keep a little bit with the feedback and understanding the complex systems and the anthro complexity type of angle. So one thing I wouldn't mind just talking about is, which I think maybe is a good segue into introducing you into the conversation, Ed, is that interplay between the technical and the cultural aspects. I mean, some things that I've experienced and I've learnt about is people are sometimes talking about culture can be a trailing indicator. Culture change can be a trailing indicator. It's not like you can just change the culture. It can be that the culture is itself reinforced by maybe the way we measure performance, by the way we're organized, maybe some of the key operating assumptions. It's not just the idea of just telling people to trust each other, for example, is if you want to build trust, you don't just say trust is great, let's all start doing it, because
never trust anyone who tells you to trust them.
Trust me, I am a doctor.
Yeah. So and this seems to relate well to some of the work that I'm aware of that you've done, Ed, in the way of strategic doing, and also the psychosocial elements of culture within various organizations, including the work you did at Purdue.
Yeah, so for us, one of the things we had to do to begin to think about culture, Chris, is to try to break it down and to think about it in a more meaningful way, because it's kind of a bit of a bumper sticker, and it's a little bit imposing to try to figure out, okay, well, how do I change culture? So, but if you think about culture in terms of patterns of thinking, patterns of behaving, and patterns of doing work together, patterns of collaborating and doing work together, then you can start to think about changing culture by changing patterns of behavior so that people behave into new ways of thinking. And that's really the experience that we try to drive in our work in strategic doing, because one of the things we learned was that, and the academics have not really picked up on this, although they're starting to, is the notion that what really matters in all of this is the conversations that we have with one another. What's the nature of those conversations? How do we design them? How do we structure them? What do we do after those conversations? And what we do consciously do in our workshops is teach people how to have conversations that are immediately translated into actual commitments and doing things together, so that you can create shared value very quickly, and people can see that by behaving in certain ways, more collaboratively, more respectfully, putting power dynamics aside for a while and trying to compress that and making everybody feel pretty much on the same level, that you can actually develop collaborations that create shared value very quickly, and that people start to see that experience is pretty powerful. So, I used to tell people that the reason strategic doing is kind of spreading around the world now, one is it's obviously an open source discipline, so anybody can use it without any problem. But the second is that the reason it's spreading is that just people have fun doing it. People have fun doing it. They start to understand with a big complex challenge that we have, we can actually start to generate some small wins that enable us to learn about this complex social system, this wicked problem that we're confronting, and that we can start to become more productive when we do that. And that if we keep our boundaries open, if we keep the process transparent and the boundaries open, that more and more resources start to come, and that actually the capacity of that network starts to grow. And so there's actually some interesting work that's done out of the Netherlands now on what these academics have called transition management. And the notion is that transforming these complex systems is really just always a matter of small wins. It's a matter of continuously focusing on small wins and accumulating those small wins, building out those networks, because the small wins actually get bigger and bigger as the network grows, as the network becomes more capable and trust starts to build across the network.
And actually, what I think is interesting about that is that those small wins can also be as the result of cross-functional team working. Actually, by focusing on the small, what we're doing is we're saying, well, actually, to the point, was it Andrew you made about it's a wonder anybody can collaborate or do anything given these complexities? Does that mean that we're saying actually for a group to collectively make sense, or sense make, and to get some agreement, a course of action, is already a pretty complex problem? So therefore, the focusing on the small wins means that we can actually solve those more generative challenges to do with how we're working together, and then start with the training wheels on, where we're starting with incremental and small change, and then building up. And actually, just to segue into, Luke, some of your interests in the arts, again, the arts is slightly ahead of us here, isn't it? Because you wouldn't start a play by running through the whole thing cold. People would start learning lines and then working on the individual elements, and then build up some momentum and some rapport. I mean, that's kind of how it works, isn't it? It's really blending those elements together in a very naturalistic way. That's pretty well put, Chris. I just wanted to add, Ed said something really interesting. He talks about experience, right? To generate that experience. And again, I would say any, let's say, model or type of thinking which sort of disregards this immediate experience of the application of the model is not worth its salt. So, and I'm not saying, again, I'm not totally against systems thinking, but you always have to factor that in and try to think, what experience does it afford me or us as a group? And Chris put it just wonderfully. If it has that like incremental building of small value and some sort of experiential progress, I think that's good enough. But to divorce yourself from that view onto the systems world and say, okay, here's the systems world, here's me viewing it, what sort of experience does it afford me or us as a group? So that's why I'm sort of like more where Chris is saying in terms of
how do you apply it as an art form which affords you an experience?
Well, it's extremely valuable to objectify things and make them explicit and be able to stand back and view them. The next obvious step, though, again, following just the logic, is to objectify yourself and be able to reflect on yourself and your own action in shaping that picture, which has been, you know, in cybernetics since the very early days and the core part of systems thinking. It's again only a very naive approach that would think of you as being outside of the system, if you see what I mean.
It's one of the reasons why cognitive diversity, having a lot of brains, can dramatically impact this, particularly if it's cognitive diversity that includes people who are outside the domain that you're dealing with. Because if it's all people in the domain, then you know, you can be stuck in your ways. What's the term? Entrainment. You know, if you have a bunch of experts who actually believe they're supposed to know what they're doing and they're working on a problem that is actually something they don't know how to deal with it, they might need somebody dramatically outside their domain to give them an orthogonal
that
view.
on its own won't do it, Andrew, will it? You need to frame it. You need to have people in the context in a way that they don't fall into that group.
Yeah, no, sure. I want to hear from Jeremy, because I'm thinking a lot about liberating structures and how liberating structures set up so many different frames and formats and approaches to bringing people together for so many different intentions, all of which is actually dealing with the big elephant in the room, which is it's all about people, right? Sure. People are the elephant in the room.
So before we go on to Jeremy and hear about liberating structures, just Roger James is asking a question about well, he's saying not a great believer in small wins management consultant stuff. For innovative R&D, it's deep wins that are required. So that's a kind of you know, a fair point that you're making, Roger. I mean, so I've got some experience of doing both. So I have some experience of R&D, and in fact, I have my name on a patent. And what I noticed is that I believe that this relates to some of the work, just back to you, Ed, in terms of you did a post recently about a PhD that you're completing, and we were talking about the scale. I suppose it's almost like a Stacy matrix type of thing, where it's on one dimension is the scale of the challenge or the number of uncertainties, and the other you know, Cartesian dimension is around the alignment of the individuals. And I suppose, Roger, I mean, I'd be interested in your views, Ed, on Roger's point that he's making.
Well, I think it's important to think about deep wins in terms of the notion of, again, bringing different disciplines together to understand the opportunities of connectivity across these disciplines. But when I talk about small wins, I'm talking about the complexity of bringing people together to work together, to build trust, to continuously build out networks. That in my experience is really focused on small wins. In other words, continuously continuously doing time buckets of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. What are we going to do together? What are we going to do together? And so that you're continuously building out a habit, a collective shared habit that brings in new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving, new ways of doing work together. That in and of itself is a complex problem. That's a really complex problem. And to address that problem, again, you don't yell at people to tell them to trust each other. You create a discipline of continuously moving on this. And this is what agile teams do. And so by doing that and giving sufficient control to the team over how that's done, you create engagement and you create trust that starts to build and new patterns. And so that's what I was referring to, as opposed to the other dimension, Chris, that you were mentioning, which I do believe that, you know, you have coming at Purdue, for example, when we started doing work in sub-Saharan Africa around the food loss problem, which is quite significant, you have to have deeper conversations that bring together all sorts of multidisciplinary teams, everything from anthropologists to soil scientists to mechanical engineers to all of those things. And you have to think in terms of a big enough idea to move the needle. And so, yeah, you have to come up with some pretty bold ideas, but as collaborators across that new network that you're building, that new network has to move incrementally, continuously. People have to see progress. People have to move forward. They'll give you 2 meetings, but if you're not doing anything after 2 meetings, you're dead. You're done. And it's not going to work. So
there has to be a felt sensation of progress, right?
Yeah, exactly, Jeremy.
Well, that's really tricky. I love Roger's last point. The point about the deep win is that allows leadership to signal that A, they know the difficulties, and B, support the many failures, allows the right culture to emerge. When you're dealing with something that's complex, it can take way more to figure out what doesn't work than it does to figure out what does, and you can't tell which is which until after you've done it. So if it's raw R&D, it makes a great deal of sense to isolate a group and give them the budget so they can accomplish that. If it's an agile team who are trying to produce a product where there's a belief that it's going to produce revenue, they need to work in much shorter bursts so that they can actually minimize the impact of any failures they're having, right? It's entirely situational. But I'm really glad that Roger brought up the point about failure. Because
this also relates, I suppose, to Simon Wardley Accidental Empires, the pioneer settler town planner type of dynamic, doesn't it? That maybe when we're in the settler domain, particularly, we're dealing with diplomacy and incremental wins and things like that. Maybe in the pioneer domain, we've got maybe people doing some big thinks and breakthroughs with the risk of failure. So I'm wondering, Jeremy, whether now is a good time to talk about the role of these techniques like liberating structures to try and introduce that variety that in our thinking that Andrew was mentioning.
Yeah, I notice in this conversation, there's a big need to disambiguate these 2 fundamentally different domains that we're sort of talking about when we think about systems, right? We have, complex systems, right? Objects, subjects out there. Then we have living human systems, right? That are holonic by nature. Right, that I myself am a complex system, right, and then the complex system of this group is sort of in me. I'm a voice for this group, and at the same time, what's going on in me right now is not just my own, right? So I notice right now. Let's try and embody this. I notice right now that I have like this very high degree of energy because I'm sort of trying to channel too much for my circuit. In the context of this group, right? I've got too much excitement and it's too big for me to sort of contain and to ground. So coming back to this idea that Ed brought in, which is boundaries, right? So for living human systems, the crucial element is boundaries. This vacillation between open boundaries and destabilization, and closing boundaries and stabilizing and sort of coming back to a state of rest so that boundaries can sort of open again and we can be ready for new destabilization. And when he describes these small wins, what I have to think of as the consistent focus that is sort of required on building that sense of trust. That it seems like it's a small win, but it requires such consistency and dedication that it's actually an enormous win, but it accumulates over time, right? So it's like Brene Brown has this metaphor of putting a penny in the bank every time you win a little bit of trust. It seems like a small win, but it accrues in such a fundamental way. So this idea of boundaries and living human systems, how do we open boundaries, but also selectively close them so that we can sort of come to rest and be okay? Liberating structures, how does this sort of tie into that stuff? I think it's a set of techniques, tools that become a way of thinking, that become a way of being in the world, that fundamentally help to maintain open boundaries, right, in the way that they operate. So without being too presumptuous, liberating structures, we are referring to this set of 33 different techniques, ways of of interacting with each other. Since you guys are mostly technical, I'll use a technical example. They're like communication algorithms, right? I run this, I go through the set of steps, and then I will get output here. And
they're facilitation recipes, right, Jeremy?
Yeah, so to speak. I think that's a little simplistic, but that's okay. It does the job. The nice thing about them is that they don't require an external facilitator. They're all simple enough to be used in a group, so that while we are using them together, I can actually participate in the discussion that they would lead us through. And so those structures lead up to, you take those specific outputs and you think of those as letters, right? So I can string that output into another structure, and it can give me another sort of predictable output, and I can string those letters together into words into sentences, paragraphs, books, right? And we can break down big things. But the essential element is they do a really good job of actively engaging people, so they have this felt sensation of being seen, heard, and important. And from there, that has a tendency of opening my boundaries, so that I can accept a little bit of difference, or just enough difference, or maybe even a lot of difference, because there's this destabilization, right? Differences destabilize my system and the system that we're in.
I really like I really like the way that you've explained that, Jeremy, and also the way that you explained the energy that you had and how you are in this system. I thought that was brilliant. The point that Ed, you were making earlier with regards to strategies and how teams creating high performance within the teams. If you have teams, if you have diversity within the teams, and those teams are not so large in group, then quite possibly you're going to get a better feedback loops, because you're within that kind of container of boundaries, acceptable boundaries. And Jeremy, one of my favorite liberating structures, oddly enough, is the eco life cycle liberating structure, and I feel so connected with that. It's the affinity sign. It's the affinity sign. So you start, and then you go through the whole structure. You go through the whole eco life cycle, and you start where it's very small. You have an idea that's just germinating, and as you're progressing that idea, then quite possibly with the data, with the feedback loop, you quickly understand that that's actually a rubbish idea. We're going to can it. And I think, again, the eco life cycle is brilliant, because you can have products which are going to be that they will only last for 2 years. Look at the pandemic, for example. You could look at the pandemic and think it's part of this eco life cycle. The pandemic starts here. We have very little data. We're very immature in understanding the impacts of the pandemic. But as you're progressing, you're gathering the data, and then you'll be being able to find the solution for this mega wicked problem along the way. I think there's so many different ways to think, and systems thinking is. I think systems thinking is vast. It's quite a vast area.
I think this is the main angle here, isn't it? And with liberating structure and things, and just realizing the world of possibilities is much, and interconnections is far greater than our capacity as humans. And this is part of the problem, isn't it? It goes back to maybe at the top of the conversation we were talking about people have that bias for action, and to deal with simplicity. I suppose this maybe relates again to the Kahneman's thinking fast and thinking slow. So one thing I wouldn't mind exploring, just in terms of practical application. Apologies, this is maybe a bit of a technical example, but one thing that I quite like when it comes down to things like feedback is actually the notion and the fashion around DevOps. So for those that don't know, DevOps is a series of methodologies and philosophies around treating development and operations as like almost a shared problem. I mean, there's lots of nuances, but I think that that's really, really interesting in terms of a conversation about systems thinking, because what I see is that in a pre-DevOps world, often I would have a development team would create something, it would be passed over. In fact, there was an example was at a conference a few years ago, Betfair, before they introduced DevOps, the developers would release the code on a Friday. So the story went, it was in the public domain because it was a conference, they enjoy their weekend, and then the site goes down on the Saturday, and then the operations people pick it up, and then developers come in on Monday and everybody starts arguing. And what they found is the first thing they did on their DevOps journey, which was probably 5 years ago now, is they made the developers share the pain. They had to have some skin in the game. So what they said is that actually, if it goes down, you're on call at the weekend. So what happened is the failure rate of their releases, obviously, it dropped. And that's systems thinking, isn't it? And then what happened is after a while, the developers said, okay, we're not going to release on a Friday, we're going to release on a Thursday. Like drops again. And what's interesting about that is what we're doing is we're showing there's a larger anthro complexity, psychosocial system to do with rewards and effort and what's good for me and what's not, what I have to worry about, what I don't have to worry about, that's actually guiding our behavior. That the way that we compartmentalize these various disciplines, in their case development and operations, actually reinforce them being not being optimal actors, that maintaining distrust between the two parties.
Yes, right the way down to recruiting using terms like rock star. Dear God, you're employing rock stars? So they're all these individuals who think that they are it, and it's going to be a career threat to them if they start to share any of their expertise with others. You can hear my experience working with tech teams in Silicon Valley coming out here, can't you?
Yeah, and I suppose what we're doing is we're actually taking two quite complex problems, and we're saying actually we can solve those better if we combine them into a very super complex problem, because then at least we're all trying to solve the same problem. And actually we've got lots of examples of how this is changing in the market because of cloud computing and things like that. Basically, it's much easier to look after things yourself when the cloud providers providing them as platform as a service or software as a service. So what that means is that we're actually getting a large movement away from treating these as separate problems, treating these as a single problem. It's very, very interesting, because what happens is, to begin with, it seems like we've made the problem harder, but then we find it then creates all of this innovation around CI/CD pipelines and automation and everything. What happens is we end up simplifying the problem and actually creating this new industry around DevOps and cloud.
Just talking about this whole systems thinking and how it changes the way we do things. I remember about 10 years ago, it could have even been longer than that. If any family did home schooling for their children, they were frowned upon. How dare you do homeschooling? Because, your child should be in school. Your child should be going to the local school. And now, if we look at the situation that we're in with the pandemic, thank goodness that there is this capability of being able to homeschool with the technology that we have. And maybe that's the culture. Maybe there is going to be a culture shift more and more, where lots of kind of ways that we did things previously, having lots of children in a classroom, is going to change. We're not going to have those sorts of behaviors.
I mean, it shows that what we use to judge whether something's a good idea or a bad idea is tenuous at best, isn't it, really? and it shows the number of assumptions that we have to make just to get by in the world, and normally they're unstated, and then we hope, maybe if my unstated assumptions are the same as Luke's, we can work together, and then suddenly we find out they're not. And so I think that's the thing that really shakes me up about getting my head around some of this stuff, is just realizing what an uncertain world we live in, and how the only way, to your point, Benjamin, about as good as we can get is to maybe be a bit less blinkered about this uncertainty and try and actually factor it in.
Everything we're talking about is about the interplay between the ability to take reliable, instinctive, predictable, quick action, and different layers of time or scale at which we have to behave in a more implicit, in that system too, very conscious, very thinking through, very kind of testing and adapting way. And we just see those interplays appear in different ways across time, in different ways across scale, in different ways across layers of more and more protected parts of the organization from outside complexity. And I think the big point I'm going to take away from this conversation is to think about intentionality of how those layers are created. The layers of instinctive, fast, predictable, reliable activity, and the layers of that more exploratory activity. And actually they all come together and they support each other, and they link together, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, this is to some extent, again, just another mention of Simon Wardley, the thought lord. He talks about, in his article about accidental empires, he says, pioneers are great people. And then he continues, settlers are great people, town planners are great people. That's the thing, I suppose. And this again relates to, I may have mentioned it before, something Susan Hasty was talking to me about, the fact that we need to turn those conflicts into tensions. And actually, that's one of the challenges that I think affects the way we deal with complexity, is often where people are exploiting the conflicts rather than exploiting the tensions. And again, this is to some extent, again, Luke, just to give you another in for like the creative disciplines, you could say that they're actually ahead of us there, aren't they? You can't have in the rock band, but if Keith Richards and Mick Jagger are strangling each other on stage, that doesn't really work well for a show.
It might be an excellent show. In fact, I just want to. It might. Because it could be a tragedy, right? So I just want to go back to your example, Chris, of the play, staging a play, and it sort of ties into what Ed was giving as an example of this, as far as I understood it, like embodied strategic thinking and acting, is that I believe, just by giving your example of staging a play, I think any work of art is basically an answer to complexity, or it's an interpretation of complexity, right? So you could argue, and a director will say, well, I want to look at a certain problem in society, and that's why I'm doing this play, or I'm going to write this play, and that's the answer. That's a complex way, or a very intricate way to look at complexity and give an answer. And you could even go further and say the whole aspect of culture is the answer how to deal with complexity, right? So there's already your, and that's why I'm sort of reluctant to see it just from a systems perspective, because I think in arts and culture you would never say art is a system or play is a system, or it's a very reductionist way of looking at art, and every artist would reject that immediately. Maybe just the iterative part, what you were saying, that you go in every day and you iterate the piece of art, but the artist themselves doesn't see it as a system or the construction of a system. That doesn't do it. I think Brian even here posted something about autopoietic systems thinking. So he's trying to bridge those two parts. Well done, Brian. Thanks for that.
It's interesting, isn't it, how culture, the arts, tend to slightly precede economics, technology, science. It's almost like, I think we said this speaking before this, it's almost like society's gut is slightly better informed than society's brain. Right.
Well, it goes into the whole question of really, which I think scholars in the strategy field have ignored for so long, is the whole notion of strategic intuition. And what I see as art is really giving us a window on an intuitive look about these complex systems, right? And so, yeah, I think for too long we've relied too much on analysis and not balanced strategic intuition. The challenge, of course, in all of this is how do we do this collectively, right? So we talk about this individually, and we can talk about the individual artist or the individual entrepreneur, but these are complex challenges that we're facing, really complex challenges that require multidisciplinary solutions, that require assets from a range of different organizations. So the issue is, how do we do this collectively, not how do we do this individually? And so that's why we come back down to our way of thinking about it. It's all about the conversations that we design. And so the notion of a lot of this, to me, and this is why liberating structures is such an important part of this to me, is that we have to design experiences for people and so much of strategy now is around design. It has nothing really to do with analysis. It's all around designing collective shared experiences. And what
I'm going to have to leave you all.
Well, thanks, Mandy.
Thank you,
Bye,
Mandy.
Mandy, come back.
Good.
Chris, I'm also going to have to jump off because I've got a whole nother group that wants to talk. So I apologize for that. But
It's hell being popular, isn't it, Ed?
Well, no, everybody's decided to do this on Thursdays. Not so much that. It's just, we're all living on Zoom and these kinds of, but this was a great conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Christopher.
Yeah, no problem, Ed, and we'll do more in the new year.
Oh yeah, okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. All right,
Thanks,
have a wonderful holiday. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering. I will actually just if anybody else wants to come on, I will post the StreamYard link just in case like emergence. We're onto we've done feedback maybe and interconnectedness. We'll do emergence. So one thing we can do with emergence is actually, I believe a bit of randomness can help and
destabilize the system.
Yeah. To what? Sorry.
Destabilize the system.
To destabilize the system, yeah, indeed. So what we can do here in terms of the emergence and the randomness is we'll post the StreamYard link and see if anybody pops up. I know there'll be one or two people who fancy coming on, so let's see. But while we're waiting for that, we'll kind of continue a little bit. So just in terms of the idea of conversations and interaction, again, I won't dwell on it too much, but I do work with setting up guilds in my current organisation, Centrica, and it's something I blogged about. And we're exploring these things, almost making it up as we go along style. We're not necessarily following a strict pattern like liberating structures or strategic doing or something like that. But what we are doing is we're carving out some time each week, typically calling it a guild for a particular topic. So, for example, we have a culture and leadership guild, and we have an employee development guild. And what we do is we keep it unstructured, but what happens is we end up with some of the same themes. Maybe we could do with experimenting with liberating structures. That's probably something that we'll bring in. But what's important is that it's a time that we have, rather like a sprint that happens every week, but it's not related to a particular outcome. And then what happens is, because there's no formal outcome, here we've got Esteban. Hi, Esteban. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
And then what happens is, because there's no I think you'll need to just turn off your YouTube. Hi, Esteban. Welcome to the show. Hi. Esteban, you'll just need
We've
to
got
turn off
positive feedback. Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I'll just mute. So Esteban, if you can still hear us, you'll need to put your thumbs up when you've when you've got it on mute. Oh, okay.
He's dropped. He's dropped.
Oh, he's dropped. Okay. I'll bring him back in. I don't know why he dropped.
Esteban, turn off the YouTube if you've still got it running.
Okay, Esteban, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right, great. So yeah, thanks for joining the show. So what are your views then on what you've heard so far?
Well, there's I'm very concerned with the whole issue of the individual and the collective. And one of the things that I focus a lot is on communication, the words being used. And sometimes I think that the terminology some people use kind of binds them into what they are can see or perceive, and they get kind of distorted in that field. I don't know how best to describe it, but a lot of conversations I see them based on duality instead of using something else. And one of the things that I try to bring to conversations is, how can I get you to put aside the negativity and focus on positive or neutral terminology? So it's a whole, it mixes a whole bunch of things in there. But when you bring them together, you realize that there's much more there. So for instance, in a conversation between two people, there's actually three meanings being shared. There's what I'm saying, there's what you're understanding, and then there is the subject matter that it should be there. I don't know if that makes sense, or if I provide enough information there.
That's really good. Are any of you guys familiar with Theory U?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, Dave Pendle talked about it.
Yeah, because what Esteban was just talking about absolutely had me think, oh yes, getting the distinctions between the 4 levels of listening and conversation in Theory U really gives you some distinctions around how to have those kind of conversations. You know, are people operating at level 1 where they're just speaking from and listening from what they already know, and they're only listening for confirmation? Or are they actually listening for disconfirmation and new things that they may not have heard before? Are they listening from the other person's perspective? Or are they actually listening with other people for what's new and emerging that was just not available before? And there's tons more to it than that, but even just having that much distinction can be really helpful as you go into conversation.
And then we're back to this question of the quality of relationship that Chris brought in, right? The quality of relationship and how that's causal to, from an Agilist perspective, the value that we create together.
Yep. And how much it is dependent on things like trust. I love the point that you made, Jeremy, that trust is created in tiny little drips. The trouble is it goes to a tank that has a hinge on the bottom, right? You can just empty it in one go. You know, I've been in a corporate situation where, as they came up to the end of the financial year, they fired 5,000 contractors so the cost to earnings ratio would look good. What they didn't realize was that it blew up trust and morale in roughly 450 teams for the next 3 months, right? The impact was just like, after 3 months, we were kind of back to more or less where we were before. It was just,
Sorry,
Esteban, you were waving.
Esteban correctly, I think he's setting up us for a little bit of an experiment here. I mean, we have another 10, 15 minutes, and it'd be interesting to do that. He's suggesting really something practical for this group now to work on. Is that's what I'm hearing, right? You were making a suggestion that we could actually use now for the conversation?
Well, for example, what you mentioned about trust. Personally, when I'm in a lot of the interactions I'm in, I don't care about who's involved. I care about the subject matter. And this is very different from what a lot of people deal with interactions. They do care a lot about who's involved and how they're behaving, and if they're going to be saving face or being put down by the comment that the other person is making. Personally, I don't care if you're right or if I'm right. What I care about is realizing what is right. And this sets up, I know that this creates a lot of conflicts with a lot of people, because they say, well, there's no right solution. There's only this and that solution. And that creates a kind of tension or a conflict of determining, well, is there a truth that we can all bind to, or is it just opinions everybody has?
So my experience, Esteban, in terms of the work I've done with guilds is I set them up based on the idea of all views are equally important, or rather everybody's right to speak is sacrosanct. And I try and, when I started these a couple of years ago, I used to say, this is the Cloud Engineers Guild. That was the first one we did. I said, I'm a cloud engineer, you're a cloud engineer, we're all cloud engineers, leave all other job titles, pay grades, and egos at the door. And I said it as a bit of a joke, but people seemed to take it to heart. And what we found is that we were focusing on the quality of the conversation and the interaction rather than the outcome. The fact that we didn't have an agenda helped, and the fact that it was week on week, and it was like basically a coffee morning in a building in Staines for about 3 months. And we started off with about 5 people, and then 8, 10, 12. And by the end of the 12 weeks, we had about 30 people, including people dialing in from around the world. And what happened is it was where we were putting the emphasis. The emphasis was based on the interaction dynamics and the quality as I attempted to perceive them. So if I felt that everybody had really been able to feel that they could contribute and they were made to feel that their views mattered, I felt it was successful. If we got to some right answer because some brain box had an idea and they just wanted to dominate the group, I didn't think that was successful. And what happened is that it felt like it did unlock lots of possibilities for us. And we felt that when that group of 30 disbanded, because that particular guild lasted about 3 months, even 6 months later, 9 months later, it felt that we could tell who had been in that initial group of people. It felt that there had been some therapeutic outcome that had stood the test of time, stood the test of reorganizations and other sorts of things. People had begun to explore their perspectives. But I think what that comes down to, Esteban, is that people have a need to express themselves often and to be heard and to be listened to and to be respected, regardless of whether they're right or wrong, because their feelings are their feelings, and it's a type of energy that we hold within us. And what I find is that while it's good to be positive, also, if people feel the need to have a rant or a complaint, it's almost like they need to get that out of their system before they can then have a reasonable conversation sometimes. So if we just make the dialogue overly, and this is my concern about maybe some of the negative sides of having more of a politically correct discourse, is that it means that we've got this energy that we're not actually using. People are bottling it up because they feel, I can't say this because it's being negative. And I see that a lot with, sometimes there is a type of management cultural element around everything must be positive and hooray and up the team and everything. I'm so proud of this, I'm so proud of that. Yes. What I see, in terms of the conversation, getting onto emergence, I see that is problematic from an emergence point of view, because what we're doing is we're constraining the type of language and the type of sentiments that people can express, and therefore people are having to be more false and less naturalistic, and therefore the emergent potential would seem to be less.
You're literally, in one way of thinking about it, making space for complexity, right? For genuine complexity of human interaction, rather than the sort of forced or contrived complicatedness of the professional sort of persona or the expectations of the space, right? And by making space for that complexity, right, creating this common good of shared space and time, right? It's like we actually have a little bubble. You're creating a little bubble of actual real life, right? That lives inside this complicated structure.
Yeah. Bringing a sample of the environment inside the safety of the organization.
So
Brian, you might need
you need to
turn off the YouTube.
Brian, feedback.
By making space for that.
So Brian, you might need to turn off the YouTube, which has a delay on it, and only have the StreamYard.
It's actually
actual real life.
So the other thing, Brian's probably watching on Periscope, and the delay is even longer on Periscope. So,
all right,
Brian, you
didn't
just
know
need
Periscope
to.
still existed.
Yeah, it does.
That's much longer, I hear. So I just wanted to make the point that what we're talking about here is that the commonality, the familiarity, the connections in community can act as either an enabling or a disabling constraint. They can either allow a community to be outward-looking and robust, and able to absorb and take on new influences, search for truth together, accept disconfirmation and even seek it out, or they can turn inwards and be about purity, what's the word, fixity, and not accepting or seeking disconfirmation. Those dynamics focus inwards and outwards, and there's always a mix of both of them. But what we're talking about with liberating structures as an intent, as I understand it, and in your guilds, Chris, is how do we steer the emergence of community? And it is an emergence. It doesn't matter what tools and methodologies you put in place to be more robust than it is locked in.
The best way I've heard all of that described is setting up the preconditions for serendipity.
So, Brian, that's a good segue into introducing you to the call. Brian's a veteran.
And let's not let Esteban's disappear.
Sorry, Esteban, did you want to ask your question first? Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment related to what you say, that everybody's opinion should be heard. From my perspective, is that some opinions should not be heard because they distract from what should be heard. And right now we have difficulties coming to the same point that matters. So one of the ways that people resolve this issue is they say, well, let's vote and see what the majority wants. Or they go to the other extreme and say, well, it depends on what I want, or it depends on what you want. From my perspective, it depends on what needs to be done or should be done. And that may be what you're proposing, or what someone else is proposing, or what someone else needs to be proposing. I don't have a solution as to how to prejudge that what someone is going to say is going to be correct and focused and forward the conversation. But I do believe that certain patterns need to be curtailed and changed. For example, let me share with you a model that at one time I created and found it very interesting, is the difference between a pessimistic, optimistic, and a realistic. The pessimistic and the optimistic are fools because none of them see the glass full. The realistic sees the glass is always full. And from there, you can go on to other things. That was just the comment that I wanted to make.
Thanks. So, Brian, did you want to say a few words? Thanks for tuning in.
I'm getting my arms around the optimist not seeing the glass full.
The optimist
trying to get my arms around.
Normally, the idea I have in mind is that the pessimist is half empty, the optimist is half full.
Okay.
Neither one sees the glass completely full, half with water, half with air, and some other stuff in there.
So the optimist isn't a scientist. I got it. So no, but I love it, Esteban. What I love is that you're coming up with this very raw realism, and we're talking a bit about that, right? In terms of human ecosystems and human felt experiences, right, Jeremy? Jeremy, did you use the phrase holonic earlier? Okay.
Brian, there's a lot of noise coming from your microphone. It sounds as though you're scratching it or something.
I'm not scratching anything. Hold on.
Something is causing the noise.
Not me. Paradox intervention.
Yeah. So let me just check it's Brian. So
is it Brian?
Well, it's still happening and Brian's on mute. So let me unmute Brian and just see if it's working then. No, it's still happening. So I wonder if it's me. So this happens. This is,
my apologies, Brian.
It's all your fault.
Calumny against your name.
Yeah. Okay. It seems to have stopped. It's gremlins.
First of all, I'm a great believer that peristalsis has to teach us all something about expansion and contraction and rhythm and even serendipity. But I went from holonic to colonic. I'm sorry. So the thing about as you guys may have seen in the chat, I've been around a couple of interesting people, and when David Bohm first came out with his work in holonomy and holo movement, that was in conjunction with my professor, Carl Pribram. And you may recognize the holographic theory of the brain somewhere in your readings back in 78-ish. And when those two guys came together about mind and matter, it caused perturbations that are being felt just now. The word holacracy, right? Mm. Organizational design systems, so forth and so on. Interference patterns. And what I find amazing is that systems thinking and neurophysiological and neuropsychological and quantum physics, speaking of convergences, right? And consciousness. And I think consciousness finally has a framework that it can be empiricized to some degree. You know, I mean, Google wants to do it. Everyone wants to do it so they can manage perception and behavior, and they can manage memory. They want to manage memory. Mm-hmm. You know, we have emotional intelligence. I'm going, it's memory. It's holographic if you want to use that as a model, right? But if you stand in a room and saying, let's all be happy, it doesn't quite work. Right.
And yet that's what you see an awful lot of management doing. It's like, well, we've given you beanbags and ice cream. What's the problem? Right?
If you can attach, if you look at the holographic and the math, it's the mathematics, really. It's the hologram. It's the Fourier transform. It's interference patterns. It's constructive, destructive patterns, all that good stuff. That really, for me, is underneath systems thinking in terms of neuropsych and physics. Mm-hmm. Okay, but when the serendipity thing, disposition, what did you say? Framework, disposition, set up the disposition for serendipity.
The preconditions for serendipity.
Okay, so I've been measuring serendipity for about 30 years in terms of frequency and extent. Okay, because it's related to the evolution of self. Now we're all having a great conversation, but all of us are fairly evolved. Okay, I mean, come on.
Speak for yourself, Brian.
I was going to say, "Oh, you flatterer." Yeah.
Oh, you know, Benjamin. I'm going to pronounce you in the Yiddish thing, Mr. Benjamin. Okay.
Fair enough. I like that.
So the point is that we represented a very, very, very small percent of the human population, guys. In my work, I'm a son of a butcher from Chicago. I'm also happen to be Irish and Catholic. That's 3 whammies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you also brought consciousness into the conversation with 3 minutes to go as well.
Yeah, I think we need more than 2 meetings.
Yeah.
Listen, I'll stop there. Just that I've been tracking I had an isolation tank in the 80s. I was doing role modeling mastery videos for elite athletes and professionals and artists, doing crazy stuff with psychological skills development, right? And I was doing machine interactive, brain interactive stuff in 84. And I'm banging my head against the wall going, what's going on? Why can't I get into the market with this? It's like,
well, it's because for the last 100 years, science has been taught in America as something that's supposed to be incredibly dull and boring.
Well, so anyway, finally, guys, after 37 years, the word aha moment becomes part of a Coca-Cola sparkling soda brand.
That's
I waited 37 years for that. And Mahali Csikszentmihalyi, I used to argue with him because he was talking about flow. He's the father of flow, as you know, right?
Yeah.
And I said, Mahali, what about aha moments? He says, what about them? Well, space and time collapsed during an insight. And I said, not just any old insight. So I spent a lot of time looking at the nature of insight, both neurophysiologically as well as between human beings. Okay, synergy, guys. But synergy within. Who mentioned something about the inside? Someone mentioned something about pieces on the inside earlier. Yeah, synergy. Synergy. Yeah, exactly, Jeremy. Synergy within correlates to a parallel evolution of synergy with others.
Nice.
And it's an evolutionary process. But people, guys, we're that small percent of the population that have are at least on a path in our lives where we have a sense of purpose we can define. And most of you guys, if I asked you what your innate gifts were, you'd probably be able to tell me something. Most people can't even come close. I like people. People can't come. Now, there's a reason. There's a reason we can't self-articulate. Because no dysfunctional patriarchy in the world wants us to do that.
Hey, yes, good. You said something about this might need more than one meeting.
Yeah, exactly. So we're pretty much out of time. So I'm wondering if we need to find a way of bringing the conversation to some type of conclusion. I mean, obviously, it's never works, but our kind of failed attempt this week. I think what my view is that behind this, what we've got is the fact that there's more to things than meets the eye, and we often encourage people really to not think about life and the way we interact in those terms, and it to some extent comes down to things that we've talked about previously on the show about uncertainty. And I think Tim Williams last week in the Red Team Thinking episode talked about the fact there is actually a discipline of unknowing and unthinking, and the fact that the world is, I think, in terms of closing off the series, for me, it's really, the world is an infinitely complex and marvelous, beautiful and terrifying place, and that's something that certainly inspires me. I'm just wondering if we want to do just like a quick round. The group, starting with you, Luke, just to your closing thoughts on this.
I think you just put it beautifully. I also am a strong proponent of putting the unknown more to the center of our attention. It doesn't matter what you're looking at or how are you looking at it, and I think that was for me now the most interesting part of the conversation, where I think systems thinking sort of enables that or proposes that. That's where it becomes interesting for me, and I think that's where it is helpful. So that's it from my side. I think the unknown should be at the center of no matter what model you use to try to understand reality.
And thank you. And Andrew?
Oh, wow, how to summarize it? Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of get comfortable with the unknown. And we were creeping up on something which left me thinking, what I want to say at the end of this is be kind to people.
Yeah.
Right.
Brilliant. Yeah. It's that's so true, isn't it? Esteban, what are your closing thoughts on this conversation?
I think we need to change from a hierarchy of patriarchy or mother to brothers. So it's not that who is on top and who's on bottom, but more side to side and forward and backwards. And to move there requires some skills. Not sure how to get there.
Thank you. And Benjamin, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, the world is, complex, unknown, unknowable, and also familiar and comforting and predictable and manageable. So I guess I would like to leave people with the concept of intentional framing. Be aware that you are choosing how you see, intentionally and unintentionally, and it comes down to that old proverb: "Take what you want," says the Lord, "only pay the price."
Brilliant. And Jeremy, the last word from you before we do wrap up. And Brian, if you want to rejoin, Brian, you've gone away, but if you want to come back, you can say something. But Jeremy.
Yeah, I'd like to say something incredibly profound. Generally, for me, the essence of systems thinking is sort of being cognizant of the relationship with things, right? Between things and that sort of transjective space, right? If we can, the more attention we pay to the relationship between things, I think that pays an extreme amount of dividends in dealing with this unknown, the unknowable, and the complex.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, that's pretty much all we've got time for this week, and this is actually the end of the season. So this is our 11th show. We'll be back in January, probably January the 7th. I'm still trying to work with people to try and get scheduled for next year. Hopefully we'll get some of the same faces back. So I've really enjoyed tonight's show. I think there's really interesting dialogue. There's clearly more topics to uncover next year, which sounds really good. So thank you very much for everybody for in the panel. So Luke, Andrew, Esteban, thanks for coming on, Benjamin, Jeremy, but also thank you to Brian, to Ed, and also to Mandy. Thank you so much to the people that have been listening to us and provoking our insight and even coming on, which is great.
And thank you, Chris. Don't leave yourself out of it. You caused this.
Thanks for
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I think these types of shows, just as a matter of interest, my kind of secret plan is to almost turn them into just like a watering hole that people can turn up and kind of talk about interesting topics, because there's a lot going on in the world, and it seems like there's a bit of a niche for people just kind of coming on and talking about this stuff, and it's pretty fun. It does take a little bit of work, so but I think it's worthwhile. And yeah, brilliant. So that's all we've got time for. We'll be back in the new year to talk all about lots of interesting topics, including the regenerative movement, which I think is fascinating and a big challenge, leadership, and lots of other topics. So that's all we've got time for. I've been your host, Chris Patton. Thank you very much.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Happy New Year.